My fellow Americans, I am so excited for the first ever episode of Uncle Sam Finds Peace Through Politics with yours truly, Uncle Sam Levin. I created this podcast for one of two reasons. First of all, I wanted to connect the younger generation to both politicians and political activists. And secondly, I wanted to seek a path to see if there truly can be unity in this country in such divisive times. With all of that being said, I have a very special guest joining me today. Please welcome State Senator of the 17th District of Pennsylvania, Senator Amanda Capelletti.
Thank you for having me today, Sam.
Thank you for joining me. This is going to be awesome. So let's jump right into it. Public service is so important in this country, although it is not the most lavish job, let's say. It comes with a lot of work, a lot of hate, a lot of disagreement. So, why did you go into the line of public service?
So, to be honest, when I look back on my life, Sam, I was always getting involved, helping, volunteering. So, I knew my career path was going to go in that direction. In fact, when I went to law school and pursued my joint degree of law degree and a master's in public health, I knew I was going to get into policy. I didn't realize at the time that that would mean running for office, but I chose to run for office after the 2016 elections. It was a rough moment for so many people. It spurred a lot of individuals to get involved. In fact, when they first asked me if I'd run for office, my answer was no. I'm grateful that they wouldn't take no for an answer, and that they persuaded me to get to a place of yes, and I ran for a local seat, and that was really gratifying and really fulfilling. And that led to an opportunity to run in 2020 in the state senate. And I decided that that was, I was going to say yes that first time around with the full support of my now husband. And it was because, life was becoming unaffordable for so many people. It was because reproductive health care was on the line. I don't think people truly understood in 2020 that Roe versus Wade was going to fall. But having come from Planned Parenthood, I knew that the other side wasn't ever going to give that up. And for me, that was deeply important. And it was just, the moment felt right. And like I said, I had the support. And ultimately, I am where I am today because people gave me the time of day. They supported me. And I just really want to use my tools and my tools to help other people be able to achieve their goals and to be able to get some level of equity in this world. It's just always been a part of who I am.
I love that. And it's such a humane answer because, people turn on the news and they look at politicians and they think they're just in it for themselves or their personal gain or who they're getting funding from. And it's nice and it's refreshing to hear the true answer of why people go into public service, not just for themselves. And I think to your point that you said, about Roe v. Wade, I think a lot of people prior to 2020 thought that there was no chance that that was ever going to be overturned and that was just always going to be the law of the land. And I think after 2020 and what has gone on the past 8 years, it's really shocked a lot of people. But to go back to your running, once you started, you got the nod that you were going to run for state senate. You were challenging a three-time incumbent, which is very tough. But I thought of one question, but as I just was talking, I think I want to switch it a little bit to the point of right now we're seeing this whole idea of getting primaried. That is a major topic going into the midterms in 2026 and into the main election in 2028. So I guess my question would be, first of all, what are the reasons people in the same party try to primary others? And then what is the reason and what can people in a seat do to protect their seats from primaries?
So I think there's a couple of answers. And what you should know is I ran against a three-time incumbent who had a history of bad behavior,
Yep.
of sexual harassment allegations against them. And to be clear, there was an ethics review or uh, almost like an HR, it's not an HR department, but an outside counsel was hired to investigate. And at the bare minimum, for me, what that report showed was that my predecessor was not behaving in a way that made all of the employees in the office feel comfortable, that made other people that you interact with in this capacity feel comfortable. And there was a lack of accountability, right? It was a constant, oh, those are jokes, those are, it's not that bad. And for me, an elected official, somebody who has to swear an oath, so police officers, law enforcement officers, military members, there's a certain additional level of ethics and moral behavior that I expect out of them. And if you're not living up to that, I think that being challenged and that information being presented and brought forward is a good thing. Um, I think you have to have a really compelling reason to run against an incumbent. And I think incumbents who dig in and do the work within their communities show up and speak out on the issues that their communities care about, they're not going to have that issue. And that's what I try to do as a part of this job, not so much worrying about whether I'm going to have a primary, but because I believe in this job and what I do, and that that is what I am to be doing. So that's how I handle it. And so far, I mean, I've had one re-election so far, and it went well. And I did not have a primary opponent, and that, is I feel partly because my community knows me. We may not agree on every little thing, but they know how to get a hold of me. They know how to be there, and that I'll be there when they need me, and that I'm going to do whatever I can to support the community's ability to thrive.
Yeah, and I mean, just from me contacting your office, it just went to show how responsive you guys were and how many different team members of your own cabinet, if that's what you want to call it, really reached out and tried to make something happen, which for me, I'm very grateful. And it just was reflective, I thought, of, how lucky your constituents are to have, something like that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and we do try our best. Things we're not perfect. Things fall through the cracks. Daily, I'm sure, but we do our best. And I take, like I said, I take the job seriously, and I think it's really important that my community knows me and that I know them.
Yeah. And that's really how public service is supposed to be, especially an elected official so close to your district, or if you're a House of Representatives, so close to who's supposed to be close to the people. Now, let's talk about some of the issues that you champion in, your own district and then for the greater Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. When we talk about it, one of the committees you sit on is the Judiciary Committee, one of which your main issues that you guys have been addressing is incarceration, which is huge across the country. Now we can just zero it in on Pennsylvania. In the last 3 years, there's been a 55.9% increase in a 55.9% of people that were incarcerated and got released in a 3 year period go back, which is a high number of people and is alarming. And that's just kind of a whole picture of what the justice system looks like as it stands currently. So, what do you think are some things that could help on this problem, and specifically in Pennsylvania?
So, reoffending is probably one of the biggest concerns people have when somebody is leaving incarceration, and including that individual, right? They don't necessarily want to go back. And what we see through the social science, and I think that's really important, Sam, is understanding that the lens that I'm bringing to this isn't just as an attorney, but it's also as somebody with their master's of public health, somebody who has studied the policy and the science to see what works and what doesn't. I think we need to do a better job at providing supports in the system as well as supports when somebody's leaving, making sure that they're able to access health care, Medicaid, and making sure that they have support finding jobs and housing. There are all of these different pieces that when you pull it all together, support individuals that are leaving in not reoffending and being able to become and be productive members of society, which I think is really what we all want. I don't think anybody wants to feel like a bump on a log or like they're a drain of resources. So it's about making sure that that support is there when somebody does need to leave, when somebody is up and able to leave from the system.
Right. And I think that's a lot of constituous concern across the country. You know, we've seen a lot of violence in the past couple of months and even years. And a lot of people come back to, well, they were accused of some offense and they got released and then they committed this crime. How do we let this happen? And I think that's a valid point from, you know, the constituents' view. But from your guys' view, there's many things you have to look at it from, you know, when they're coming out, you need to have things in place to help them get on their feet and not go back to the situation that they were already in.
Mhm.
And then also, you know, the sentencing, I know it's a number of months, years, days, whatever that may be, but it also matters on their personal growth inside incarceration. So how do you guys manage that when you're coming up with new laws and new regulations to really help this system move along?
Well, there's a variety of programming that we can support through the Department of Corrections that involves getting licensure, that involves learning a skill or a trade. And some of that is even legislation that can ensure that they're getting paid, that they can leave a facility to do some level of work and be paid properly for it. Because that's another piece of the puzzle is, you know, when they are doing some of this work in our systems, how much are they being paid and are they able to then use that money for restitution of their crimes? Not if you're making 50 cents an hour, right? You're not
Right.
going to make enough money to do that, let alone be able to get supplies that you might need. So I think that there are a variety of ways that we're looking at when it comes to that. And one of the programs that comes to mind is Little Scandinavia. Little Scandinavia, I believe, is in Chester, the prison of Chester. And it is a small, close-knit group that works very specifically with guards that have specific training that goes into a lot more of emotional health and well-being and learning how to control emotions and really addressing some of the root causes of why a person might have come into contact with the criminal justice system to begin with, right? So understanding the trauma that they've been through and addressing that and working so that they don't re-traumatize themselves or other people. It's been a great program that is being studied with specifically a Scandinavian country. I forget specifically which one, but there's a whole study and a whole report on it, and they're continuing to grow that as a way to help individuals really address the root issues so that they don't reoffend when they come back out. There's also specific programming for individuals who are diagnosed with ASD or autism spectrum disorder. And if they're on the spectrum, being able to go somewhere very specific that is safer for them with trained guards who understand how individuals with autism might react as opposed to how somebody not on the spectrum might react to certain engagements. So there are a variety of different ways to start looking at how an individual can succeed and giving them the tools, getting them the diagnosis, what have you, to be able to, you know, work into these programs that are in the system, to work with the not just the programs that the systems are running, but then also the outside volunteers and advocates that come in and run programming, right? For GEDs, for associate's degrees, and higher up. Like there's a number of different programming events that happen depending on which facility you're at and what's available. So I think that all of those different opportunities for growth exist within the system, and a lot more people take advantage of it than you might realize.
But to that exact point where you just said more people take advantage than you realize, constituents as a whole don't realize that all of these things are happening. And the fact that, you know, you're not the senator, but you're the state senator and you're making so much of an impact on your district's community is something that people I don't think fully understand. And the fact that a lot of times on these major issues like incarceration, like education, people look to the federal government a lot of the times and they don't realize that the biggest impact is within a certain state because the state does have so much power within the certain rules and regulations that you have to follow.
Sam, that's a great point. And actually, I want to highlight that when I went to law school, I thought I wanted to be in Washington, D.C. I thought that's where I was going to make the greatest impact. I did a whole program that took me to Washington, D.C. for the summer. I thought the federal government was where I wanted to be. But the more I sat with it at law school and the more experience I gained, I realized a lot of the laws that are being litigated, a lot of the things that we're talking about, they're state laws.
Yep.
That's really what impacts your day to day more than anything else. The federal government is incredibly important. I don't want to take away from that. But not enough people truly understand state government and how important it is. I don't know that enough people know the branches of state government or who your state senator or state representative or assemblyman might be, depending on which state you're in and how that's all framed and what it looks like. There is just a real lack of education around state civics. And truly, state civics, I think, is the most important in our day to day, understanding how your state works.
I just cracked a little smirk there because there is no better transition into what I wanted to talk about next, which is education. And this is another thing that early on in your career, you were really championing about early education. But something that is so important that I've been advocating for a ton recently has been this idea of mandatory civics classes. You know, this we in America, we focus so much on the STEM topics, the math and the sciences. But something that's not really talked about is, knowing our own systems of government. And, like I can remember going back to fourth grade, I learned like the president and the vice president. And then really not until high school did I learn United States history that wasn't ancient history in middle school. And, I took it upon myself to take an optional government class in my senior year. So to be fair, like I know maybe a little bit more than the majority, but not enough that I even think is suitable for what should be, someone who's allowed to vote and make and have my voice heard on decisions that I don't even know about. So what are your thoughts on having more civics and learning the deeper roots of, how our country really works?
Uh, I am fully supportive of expanding and improving civics education and being inclusive of state government. And I think, STEM is so, so important, but I don't think you can pull out of STEM the importance. You can focus on STEM, but there's a level of importance that comes with English and history and civics that goes hand in hand, right? You can watch all of that play out in real time today. We've got STEM on one hand with AI and what is happening with AI and how is that impacting our everyday lives and how do we regulate it and what does that look like and who has what authority to regulate it, right? Well, that's all civics kind of talk, but interplayed with STEM and being able to communicate about what AI is and what AI is doing is English. And then understanding the history of how we got to this point and what it's been like to try and have education and government keep up with the development of technology, which, spoiler alert, it hasn't done very well, right? But like understanding that history and understanding how we got to the behemoths of like a Facebook, right? And a Google, and how they're all kind of taking over in these various spaces. That's all really, really important information that I think we need to understand the history of, communicate about, but then also have people in my position serving in public service and in civics type spaces that have a strong understanding of how technology works. It's complicated how we get there, but I think having that premise of a full education that focuses on that kind of that 360 view is absolutely important. Absolutely.
And I love the fact that you mentioned this idea of communication, which is so tough, especially in this day and age when it comes to politics. One reason I started this podcast was because instead of talking about it, people just ignore it. And if we ignore it, then nobody's involved. And that's where our country turns into what it looks like right now, with a lot of divide and unable to compromise. And, a lot of uneducated things are thrown out today, which causes a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation, and a lot of harm in the end. You hear these big words being thrown out by one side, which is fascist, on the other side, communist, or, that's illegal versus what is legal. But to the most, we don't like to most common Americans, I would probably, I don't know, I'm going to throw out a number of 95% don't understand really if it's legal or not, besides trusting whoever your most trusted news source might be. So, do you think that, more education in the civics will, lower violence in turn and lower this age we're in of just, a lack of agreement?
I think the rhetoric is really tough. You're right. It is truly hard, especially when we are allowing ourselves to live in echo chambers. And part of that problem is the advent of social media, right? The advent of the internet. Um, when I was in elementary school and even somewhat into junior high, it was a lot of library time to do research. Even in college, there was still going to the library, pulling from the card catalog to try and find books to quote and read sources from. And everything's online now. Everything's on social media. You can pick and choose what your source is, and that's tough. That's tough noise to break through. But what I want people to really know is look to your left and look to your right. Don't surround yourself with people who think exactly like you do. I grew up in a politically diverse family. My dad's a Republican, my brother's an independent, my mom's probably a more moderate Democrat. I'm the crazy lefty. Like, I get it. We've been there. We've done that. I've argued politics with my dad over breakfast so many times. And when the food comes, we're laughing about something that happened in the family, right? That's just so, so important to try and humanize and recognize it's important to have those conversations. You don't have to agree on everything, but there's definitely a lot of things that we do agree on. And having those conversations instead of communicating through text message or I'm going to date myself and I apologize, WhatsApp or Instagram Messenger, like whatever you're using, right? There's a lot of different platforms now. Talk face to face. Have those conversations. Learn to hold your tongue and not interrupt. Now, it's hard. Don't get me wrong. It's not like I'm perfect, but it's important to try and to have those conversations. And when you're learning about civics and how things work, I think that that will help you have those conversations because if you start to understand what it is that the Constitution says and does not say, whether you're talking about the federal constitution or, hey, we have a state constitution that has some really important stuff in it too. Those are, excuse me, those are really important things. You start to understand, okay, my end goal is X. This is what the Constitution says. So these are the lanes I can go through to get to X. And, somebody else's end goal can be Z. And they have different paths via what's legal and right and through the Constitution by going through Z. But that only happens when we have that education of knowing civics and we have that education of talking to people. Because no matter how progressive I might be on politics, Pennsylvania is a purple state. I've got to find compromise and work with people who have slightly differing or very differing views to get things done. So we've got to figure out your end goal's over here, my end goal's over here, but we have a similar thing that we can do that kind of achieves both of what we want. Maybe not all of it, but that only happens with conversation and understanding civics.
And again, that's so nice to hear just because right now it seems like it's either my idea or it's my way or the highway, basically, which, we're seeing way more often than not. But, my biggest gripe right now with politics is, I hear a lot of people saying what they don't like, but what I don't hear is what idea they do have that is better. we can all agree that the healthcare system is insanely messed up, and whether you like Obamacare or not, that's one discussion. But then what is your idea that comes to the table that's better or different? And that's kind of, where I'm at in politics right now, where it's I just want to see new ideas. I don't want to just see why you don't like it. I want to hear what is good about the idea that you're bringing to the table. And I think that's so important, not just about healthcare, but so many topics that are being talked about right now. And speaking of healthcare, Pennsylvania had a similar situation to the federal government as it had a shutdown. I know the federal government had to do with healthcare, but you guys not as much. It was more about a budget and finding what you guys wanted to spend. The Republicans came to the table in the Senate. I know you're in the minority because the Senate is run by Republicans in Pennsylvania and the House is run by Democrats with a Democratic governor. So you guys are split, which makes government sometimes difficult. Now, when the Republicans came to the table in the Senate, you guys sent a bill over that was basically a flat bill, to my understanding, which basically means that the spending from the year before will be rather the same to this year. Where then you guys wanted to spend more money on certain issues. So how did you eventually come to your solution? It's for everyone listening. Pennsylvania's budget is due July 1st, to my understanding. And you guys got it done in late September or October?
November.
November. Okay. I was even off more than that. Okay. So it's due July 1st, and you guys got it done in November. So that is a long time to be waiting for a new budget when, the year is coming to a start quicker than we think. So, how did you guys get to that agreement in the end?
So, look, to be clear, I'm not at the negotiating tables. The negotiating table for those discussions are, the Senate Democrat leadership, Senate Republican leadership, House Democratic leadership, House Republican leadership, and the governors. Those are the people who ultimately work through that. Now, we give our leaders, information about what's important to us collectively as a caucus and individually to go through that process. So I can't speak to exactly how we got to where we were, where we ended up. What I can say is there is absolutely no reason on God's green earth outside of political theater and this kind of fraught time of you versus me mentality that we should have been this late on a budget. The difference between the federal government and the state government in these moments is that long before I was a senator, they changed the rules to ensure people still got paid when a budget impasse would happen. Whereas in the federal government, as you know, many people did not get paid and were, you know, I'm going to say laid off. It's not the right term, but they weren't working and were not getting paid unless they were essential. So this moment was very, very frustrating for me because it felt like all of the information we were getting was that goalposts were being moved, things were being changed, and there was never going to be a win-win until we got to our final product. And even then, we had some big misses in terms of what we did fund or what we didn't fund. And that's really frustrating. But it's what's happening right now, as you said, when people are in this mentality of us versus them, and it is not having conversations, and it's really indicative of where we are in politics right now.
And let me ask you, because, and this is what everyone should be doing. I listened to an interview with a senator that is a Republican, and one of the things that she was maybe acceptable to was, obviously you have to count for inflation every year, but then also just doing a 5% increase on a budget every year. So what you spent the year before plus 5% because things get more expensive, you might want to add something, take something away. Is that something that you think would be reasonable to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
I think we would have to have a real conversation on what that would look like in practice. I'm open to having those discussions, to sitting down with budget experts. My concern is there will be different times where we need more of one thing than we do another.
Right.
And I think if Let's just take education, for example, because it's a very easy one. We fund our public education systems in Pennsylvania through states and local property taxes. If that 5% doesn't actually address the growing need of our public education systems, which could be indicative of, a baby boom, so to speak, and an increase in individuals that are attending our public schools, that could be really harmful. So I think we'd have to kind of play out a bunch of scenarios. I'm open to finding what we could or could not do in terms of that. But I think the more important piece in all of this is understanding that my colleagues across the aisle have said on many occasions, and you may have heard them say this listening, this person, I don't know who you heard, but this person may have talked about the structural deficit, which means that we are spending more money than we're taking in.
Yep.
But they don't want to do anything to increase new streams of revenue or to increase revenue, right? We could close some corporate tax loopholes that exist, which many, many states have already done. We are one of a handful of states that haven't. We could legalize marijuana. I understand it's still a bit controversial in some parts of the state, but to be clear, almost every state that borders us has done so and is getting all of our revenue that we could just get right here and improve our own economy. There are things we could be doing that would have addressed some of their concerns over the structural deficit. I just find it very disingenuous to go on and on about a structural deficit and not provide a solution for increasing revenue and addressing the problem.
Which comes to my point that I made earlier, which is, you can fight the issue, but we want to see change actually and what you're bringing to the table instead of, just hating on one, big point that they're pointing out. And something that again, you're really killing it with all the things I want to bring up. Schools misfunding. That is huge. In New Jersey, that's a huge issue where I'm from. My senior year of high school, I spoke to the Senate Appropriations Committee about why my school shouldn't be cut by $4.5 million. And I explained in a very interesting analogy or metaphor, whatever you want to call it, that schools are like Jenga pieces. And once you build them and then you start taking things from the structure, they will start to fall. So when it comes to schools, it's very mind-boggling that we're just misfunding schools. There's many schools in New Jersey where in my neighboring towns that are actually going to go out completely and be bankrupted because they're not being funded, which is almost laughable because, schools are the very essential thing to what makes this country, great in the sense of, education system. So why is this happening and why isn't school and education the forefront of anyone's budget?
So I am going to allow myself to be very political about this one for
Go
you.
ahead.
Um, I try normally when I do these things, I do try to, be as nonpartisan and talk about the issues I care about. But like, this is there is an issue with school vouchers and private school funding. It's called EIT. There's a program called EITC in Pennsylvania. It is not the earned income tax credit. It is the education income tax credit, maybe. I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but it is a tax credit that individuals get or that for donating to their private schools or their parochial schools, and it's supposed to help with the funding, but you get a tax credit towards it. So essentially, in a roundabout way, taxpayer dollars are helping to fund our public and parochial, our private and parochial schools, excuse me. When you look at the advocacy organizations, when you look at who is funding whose campaign, it is people who are profiting from charter schools that are funding the campaigns of mostly, now not all, but mostly Republican senators, at least in my chamber. I can't necessarily speak to the House. You are looking at people who are being bankrolled to be state senators to push these types of policies. These are schools that are not held to the same standard as public schools, have the ability to discriminate on any reason, the ability of the student, their gender identity, or their, who they love, what their families look like. I mean, any number of things these schools can do that. So that is not to say there aren't Republicans, because there are, who care about public education. And when I first came in to office, Senator Tommy Tomlinson out of Bucks County was a big advocate for public education, big advocate for it. And he, like I said, Republican out of Bucks County, real supportive of it. So it's not entirely a partisan issue, but when you look at these things, that you're looking at people who want their kids to be educated in a parochial school, which is, a Christian or a Catholic school. And like, fine, if that's your education, great. I have cousins and family members who all went through, Catholic schools. That is not to say that we should be using our taxpayer dollars to fund parochial education. These voucher programs that have been pushed, they decimate our public education systems, completely break them, and pull significant amounts of money from them. And again, when you look at the campaign finance reports of the individuals who are pushing this, um, you will find they get a lot of money from advocacy organizations and individuals who are profiting from those types of programs. So that is where they'll tell you education's top of mind. What they won't tell you is it's not public education. They want people to be learning a Catholic or a Christian education. They want, their buddies to make X amount of dollars per student off of, this charter school or this private school. And that is really frustrating, considering in Pennsylvania, we have written into our Constitution the right to a quality public education, which ultimately we were sued over not enforcing, found to be in dereliction of our duty, and told by the courts, as a legislative body, we must properly fund our public education systems. And so we went through that entire process, spent a lot of money on it, and instead of just doing the job, we are now legally obligated to do the job of funding our public education systems.
Right. And like you're saying, it just is really a crazy thing just because, again, I don't have the statistics up, but a vast majority of people, of students living in each state do go to public school. Private school is very much a privilege to many people, usually favoring the more fortunate and, the more they end up maybe with higher education or more affluent areas is what the word I was looking for, which is just continuously uh continuing that gap between the educated and the uneducated
Mhm,
and this system that everyone's or some people are trying to break.
mhm,
Additionally, with the funding conversation, which is very significant to your counties amongst the Philadelphia area, which is the SEPTA conversation, Josh Shapiro redirected $153 million in federal highway funds that were supposed to go to more rural Pennsylvania to fund SEPTA. And my question here would be, SEPTA, as big as and as important it is to these communities, it continuously is coming back to you guys asking for money. And at some point, you would hope that they would come up with new ideas. And I was reading into it, and they did pledge to do certain things, but it seems like it's not necessarily working. Riders are down 36% since COVID. When you look at it, they get only 1% of their income from their riders. You have their workers who they have a very high turnover rate with their workers. There's so many people that are anti public transit because they think it's dangerous, unsafe, it's uncleanly, whatever the case may be. So what is the reason to keep giving so much money or taking money from another project to put it into SEPTA when there's a lot of flaws with it?
So I think that's a lot of misinformation, truly. I actually think if you're down here in the Southeast, in my experience, overwhelmingly, those are not the views. The people that use SEPTA don't view SEPTA like that. And there are even people who don't use SEPTA that do not view SEPTA like that. They view it as a positive, and what we know is that it's an economic driver here in the Southeast. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I can tell you that SEPTA drives the economy of the Southeast. Literally, they are a huge piece of why people move into at least many of the communities I represent, and I know many other surrounding areas as well. And the Southeast is the economic driver of Pennsylvania. Um, we are donor counties. What does that mean? That means that we pay more in taxes than we get back in state taxes, state funded tax, programs or supports, right? So that's what SEPTA is about. But I think the bigger concern is public transit is a public good. It is not something that should be privatized or partnered with, corporations, for-profit industries. Um, it is something that we need to make sure functions and serves the public good, as that's what it is. And it's not just about SEPTA. Lanta up in the Lehigh Valley is growing exponentially and needs more support, and we didn't provide funding for that. It's PRT in Pittsburgh, I believe, that is in need of support. It's not just SEPTA. They made it about SEPTA, but public transit exists in all 67 counties in some capacity or another. Um, and it all is in need of funding. We can certainly discuss various guardrails around how to improve SEPTA. What does that look like? Absolutely. We can talk about those things, right? And I think SEPTA has been at the table willing to have those conversations and talk about what we can do and what laws we can pass that help secure that they will do those things. But at the end of the day, the counties that are, money was initially pulled from, they're still getting their money. Their projects were just pushed back on when they were going to get done. But if SEPTA doesn't function, the Southeast doesn't function, those roads and bridges in those rural counties don't get the funding to get fixed. That's how this works. And it is incredibly important going into 2026, which is the part that is most mind boggling to me, where so much attention is going to be focused really in the Southeast because it was so important to the history of this country and is so important to the history of this country that we would allow people from all over the world where public transit is immaculate, is functioning well and on time. And I could go on and on. I have been fortunate enough to visit, multiple countries where the public transit was just, something we could only hope to have.
Spectacular.
Yeah. And we're going to allow them to come here to visit here and see a crumbling infrastructure. And what's that going to say to them? Are they going to want to come back and continue to boost up our economy and to visit more of what we have, to go check out the Poconos, to go from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh or to Erie? We are not setting ourselves up for success if we're not investing in those things. So I think what Governor Shapiro is doing, he is doing his best to ensure that we are using every tool and lever to support the Southeast that is going to have the World Cup, that has the 250th anniversary of, the foundation of this country, that's going to have the MLB All-Star game, and ensure that those people who come to visit, whether they're staying in Montgomery County, they're staying in Bucks County or Delaware County, whether they're staying in Chester or in Philly itself, they will be able to use a public transit system that can function, that is clean, and is a healthy transit system.
Well, first of all, I love your passion on this issue because again, it's just so important to the foundation of this country. And you're right, when it comes to other countries, the public system, everyone loves the public system. And then, when you use the word public transit in America, a lot of people will actually kind of shudder at that idea and actually try to do everything they can not to use it, unless certain circumstances, they're in certain circumstances. So, this idea of public transit and this conversation, you're right, it's not just the Southeast issue. Pittsburgh has it and these other places amongst the whole country. So how do we get voters to focus on public transit as an issue when most of the time, we're the focus is on the economy and, how do we fund and get better public transit? They need more money. How are we going to get that? Taxes? Things like that.
So I think there's a couple of things here, and I'm going to not name names, but I had a colleague say on the floor of the Senate that they were very proud to be from a rural community. Great, me too. Um, and say that they didn't truly understand, public transit or the costs of public transit until they started working for the legislature and da 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 da. I think that's really disingenuous. I grew up in a rural community as well. I knew how important public transit was. I knew what it was and that it was an economic driver for many, many reasons. And one of those reasons that I knew about it is because a long time ago, it was more active.
Yep.
Where I grew up and where my parents grew up, and in their time, the Reading Railroad actually came through the town that my parents grew up in, and you could ride down to Philly. And I would hear stories about this. And can I tell you, as like a 12-year-old who wanted to go explore and assert her independence, and no, I don't think 12-year-olds should be that independent, but I wanted to be. I complained about the fact that the train didn't exist anymore and how unfair that was, right? I think it's disingenuous to say rural communities or everyday voters don't care about this. I think more of them care about it than we know. They may not be vocal about it. Um, it may not be their top issue, but I think they care. And I think they care because they're smart. They understand. They don't want to drive into Philly if they don't have to. I have plenty of family that come to Philly by stopping at the Norristown Transportation Center, stop at the North Wales Transportation Center, like, finding somewhere out here in the burbs to stop at and then ride the train into the city. I think a lot of people like doing that. Is there an Amtrak station they'll stop at? Absolutely. Wherever they might find it. Absolutely. And the other piece of all of this is I think it's more about the partisan politics. It's about the politician almost and where they're supposed to stand, I guess. And again, they keep making it about SEPTA. I speak about SEPTA because I'm from the Southeast, but
Yeah.
it's not just about SEPTA. Lancaster has one. Johnstown has public transit, up in the Scranton area. Like there's pockets of it everywhere. And I'd also like to highlight, as I'm going on this lovely little rant for you, I believe Pennsylvania is the only state that doesn't cover their costs of their public transit systems that use Amtrak rails. So some of the train systems have to use existing rails to be able to work, and that happens to be owned by Amtrak. There are many other states that have that baked into their budget, New Jersey being one of them. That's just automatically a state cost for their public transit to function. We don't do that. That's part of the reason there are budgetary issues for some of our transit companies and transit authorities because they have to figure out how to pay for the rent of those rails that other states don't make their transit companies figure out.
That is crazy. And I'm glad we're having this conversation because I had no idea. And then I don't want to take too much of your time and the whole broad idea of what this podcast is about is getting people excited about the political process, getting people talking, and most importantly, getting the younger generation involved. So let's talk about that. Why are young people so important, and what can they do to get a part of the political process?
So in Pennsylvania, I'm going to speak Pennsylvania specific, but you can figure out what this looks like in whatever state you're from or whatever state you will vote in one day. Would encourage you to vote in Pennsylvania as you are here in at Penn State. So there are local county parties. I'm not going to tell you which party you need to be a part of or get involved with those. Get involved with an organization that does advocacy on whether it's the environment or education, reproductive rights, the economy. There's a lot of different ways to get involved. Reach out to your local electeds, your state electeds, your state house member, your state senator. Tell them you want to get involved. You want to know those things. But the thing that's most important is that people know that there is an election every 6 months in Pennsylvania or thereabouts. Every spring there is a primary, every fall there is a general. In the odd number years, like we just had, you guys probably saw lots of ads that had to do with the judicial races and retention of Supreme Court justices. They judges up and down the ballot, from magisterial district judges who you're paying your speeding tickets to, all the way up to the top, as you saw. You have county elected officials that are on that, district attorneys. You have school boards, you have your county, excuse me, not your county, your local township supervisors, borough council members, mayors. All of those individuals would be running in odd number years. I could talk to you over and over again about why they are so important. I could name issues that each one of them impacts. And I'd be happy to do that, having conversations. I don't want to take up too much time talking about it, but that's your odd number years. Your even numbered years are going to be people like me, your state electeds, your governors, your attorney generals. You're going to be your US Congress people, US senators, and your presidents. You know, kind of the even numbered years, how those are all very, very important. But people tend to fall off on the importance of the odd number years that we just had. Although we saw a huge increase in turnout this year, which was wonderful, but we tend to have a fall off. I don't want to see that anymore. Your school board's talking about book banning, what books are allowed in your schools or not allowed in your schools. All of that comes through in who is your school board member or who is your county commissioner and what's allowed in your local public libraries, however you feel about it. Those are like those are who are deciding those issues, right? And then judges, I don't think I need to tell anybody how important a judge is. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, and your DAs are really important too. There are so many different levels to all of that. So it's so important that you're voting in each of these elections, not just because it creates accountability in who's serving your communities and addressing the issues you care about, but it also helps to create a pipeline. I'm never going to tell somebody to wait their turn when it comes to running for office. I'm never going to tell somebody not to get involved because I think everybody's voice is important and you need to figure out what that looks like and how you get involved. But if you start getting involved at this local level, you start to make the right connections, you start to know people. That's ultimately what happened to me was I just got involved locally. I got to know people in the party. And so when the opportunity arose for me to run for office and run for Senate, it wasn't on my agenda, but you don't know what doors are going to open for you because you decided to run for township supervisor, borough council, school board, whatever it might be. People get to know you, and then you become a trusted face, and it creates a good pipeline of good people who want to help and do the right thing.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the first ever episode of Uncle Sam Finds Peace Through Politics. I cannot thank you enough. This is awesome, and I hope everyone listening enjoyed because there's a lot more coming your way. Make sure you stay involved, watch the news, check multiple sources, and all in all, come back to Uncle Sam Finds Peace Through Politics. I will see you for next episode.